Good evening. Welcome, everyone. It's really thrilling and humbling and daunting for me to be here with Richie Davidson. I'm really, really happy to be here with you. Richie and I got to know each other when I was, another thing I do in the world is kind of consulting, organizational development, management consulting, and I was working with the Mind and Life Institute for several years. So we got to know each other.
And we desperately needed your help. Still do.
And so it was good work, and we got to know each other and got through a few dramas. And you know, there's always, behind all the great work, there's always a sausage machine somewhere. And sometimes that's kind of my work, get in there and work with the sausage machine. But I'm very humbled and very happy to be here with Richie and all of you. And I think we're just getting a little feedback here. The kind of setup for tonight's dialogue is Richie's the science guy and I'm the Dharma guy. Although Richie could easily do the Dharma guy role, I certainly couldn't pull off the Richie role or even dream of it. But I am trained as a clinician, and if I keep my nose to the grindstone, I'll have my doctorate in about 4 months. And I'm the principal investigator for a couple of studies right now. But it's certainly not my specialty. But nonetheless, I'm going to steal Richie's thunder here tonight a little bit and start a study right here, right now, with all of you. And so I'd like to invite you all to approach this dialogue and time we're going to spend together tonight with the age-old tradition of introspective participatory science, and to work with your own innate or inner capacities for biofeedback, as it were. And so I'm going to lead us in a meditation right now. But I'd really like to invite you all throughout the dialogue tonight for all of us, including Richie and I up here, to try to, keep coming back to, and to some extent maintain if we can, but keep coming back to a really deeply felt embodied presence of body, heart, and mind as we're here together tonight. And, personally, I tend to think one of the great benefits of the work Richie's been doing and all the science that's coming about is that someday I think one of the next evolutions of human beings, Richie may, as he listens to me, may think I'm crazy, but I think all know how biofeedbacks work, and maybe you've been hooked up to something that measures your heartbeat and seeing you could change it with your mind, your attention, or maybe you've done the heart math stuff where you get to fill in that cool little landscape as you self-regulate. But I think we're going to become sort of so self-aware of our own neurobiology and our brain processes as we get all this information that we're going to begin to be able to self-regulate at profoundly advanced levels compared to what we're able to do now. I just suspect that. So anyway, we're going to do an experiment tonight in that. So I'm inviting you to do that, to really engage in that kind of self-aware self-regulation while we're going through this talk together. So, and then maybe we'll check in with you at the end. So if you will allow me to just guide you a little bit, we'll just kind of move into that. So finding a posture that for you feels naturally uplifted, dignified, relaxed, awake, stable, whatever that is for you. Whether you want to use the back of the chair or sit forward, just find something that feels naturally uplifted, dignified, and awake for you. And either keep your eyes open or close your eyes if you want to kind of go inward for a moment, or shift the eye gaze down and soften your gaze. And just gently begin gathering the threads of your attention that, as we know, tend to go all over the place, pulled in many directions, and just begin to sort of bring them home, as it were. And just gently returning again and again to the felt experience of being alive and here, present right now in this human body. Allowing ourselves to really feel the body at the physical sensate level. One of the kind of perhaps downsides of our amazing conceptual abilities as human beings is that we very quickly replace direct experience with concept. So body is just a word, a concept. The breath is just a word, a concept. So the invitation is slowly, gradually, gently dropping into really feeling the body and the breath in terms of the actual tactile physical sensations that are continually arising and falling away in our own personal direct experience of being alive in a human body right here, right now. And when our mind wanders, as minds tend to do, just gently bringing it back again and again to the body and to the breath. Tuning into and being willing to feel all of the different sensations arising on the surface of our skin from head to toe. Contact with the chair and the ground, our clothing, the air, movement of the air. Movement of the breath with the belly rising and falling, the rib cage opening and closing, the air across the nostrils or perhaps the parted lips. Just deepening and deepening a curiosity about our own experience right here, right now. And a willingness to feel whatever we're feeling, including the full range of that which arises as comfortable or uncomfortable, pleasurable or painful, and everything in between. And also kind of flipping that internal switch and awakening to all the sensate experience within the body, even the body's own capacity to know itself, to be aware of itself, interoception, and feeling all the internal processes. The blood flow, pulse, heartbeat, flow of nervous energy, sensations of aliveness or numbness, the overall weight and mass of the muscles and bones. Just deepening, moment after moment, breath after breath, deepening and deepening this felt presence, this felt embodied presence. Including the other sense perceptions as they're arising, including our heart, whatever might be going on for us emotionally, mood, different layers, subtle or not so subtle, of peace, contentment, sadness, frustration, boredom, just whatever might be arising, even outside of our awareness, there's always layers of emotion present. And also including whatever is happening cognitively with our thinking mind. So leaving nothing out, leaving nothing out. Just opening further and further, including the whole thing, the good, bad, and the ugly of our experience, and seeing the beauty in all of it, in our fundamental humanity that we all share. Every possible emotion, every possible thought, every possible sensation. Our shared humanity. And finding within that a natural kind of innate goodness and wholeness that we can directly experience, that leaves nothing out. And giving ourselves deep, deep permission to simply be just as we are. So I invite all of us to just keep touching back into this deeply felt embodied presence of the physicality of our experience, the other sense perceptions, our heart, our emotions, as well as whatever's going on in our thinking mind. And just keep coming back to that. And as we increase this kind of intra-subjective awareness, we naturally can tune into each other and realize that we're here in this very beautiful space with a lot of other wonderful beings and really feel held in this intersubjective presence, abiding presence of our human hearts and bodies and minds together. We'll see what it's like to have a dialogue in this context and working together to generate this kind of field together. Okay, thank you. So just tapping back into that again and again. Maybe we'll pause now and then. But I wanted to just kick this off by, when we think about mindfulness and how it can benefit society, through my experience of my own life, and somehow managing to compartmentalize my life such that after 10 years of Dharma practice and getting a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology, I was still able to get myself into a federal prison with a no parole 30-year sentence for drug smuggling. That takes some doing. Not something I'm proud of, but it did make me very curious about the human condition and how could that have possibly happened. And I realized the only way out was to completely own my experience, although I was very tempted to kind of say the devil made me do it, because I was like, how could this happen? And but I was actually pretty clear about how it happened, actually, because I was aware of both sides of what were going on in my life and had been going on for a while. And I was also really, it was a huge wake-up call, and became passionately interested in figuring this out because of the devastation I'd caused to my son and my family and so many others. So kind of what I've tuned into in really simplistic terms over the years is that this human condition that we're all born into, this wonderful opportunity called life, is kind of a setup to live survival-based, fear-based, mechanical, habitual lives, because, you know, the job one for any species is survival, and so our whole neurobiology has been set up that way for millions of years. And unexamined, that's where it goes. And then we co-create a culture and institutions and that are fear-based and habitual and mechanical and can be shame-based and blame-based. And throughout that, of course, is threaded all kinds of wonderful things that we've been able to accomplish and wonderful human values. So it's like there is this propensity to, almost without awareness, to be condemned to this kind of mechanical, fear-based life, even if we're very high-functioning people. You know, living what Thoreau called lives of quiet desperation, sort of waiting for that other shoe to drop. Because we've never really deeply examined this or found a way to deeply come home. So we don't really fundamentally have a home. Our home is out there somewhere to whatever is confirming our existence or our sense of worthiness, you know, our bank account or our jobs or our friends, or it's all external confirmation, and we haven't really done the work to really find our home here. And so there's that, but the whole thing, no matter how negative it can get, is completely saturated and permeated with the human heart and our tenderness and our vulnerability and what in some traditions we call innate basic goodness, or what in the Dharma traditions are called Buddha nature. And so this same situation that could be, you know, sort of condemn us to a habitual fear-based life is also the springboard at any moment in every way, in every dimension, to awakening and to further compassion and further vulnerability and to maybe the highest things that we can aspire to as human beings. So that's the kind of milieu I wanted to start with, because I think if we talk about how can we benefit society, it seems like, especially a lot of the people I work with who are really struggling and from the circumstances they found themselves in, it seems like the things they most need are even just a little bit of self-agency, to where they can begin to not just be victims of their own conditioning in the world around them, but begin to take some way of self-empowering themselves through some level of awareness, and then reclaiming the undeniable thread back to that self-knowledge that we all have of our own innate goodness, no matter how the world has conspired to talk us out of it and convince us of our unworthiness. We know somewhere way back in there, we know that all that is a lie, And in fact, we are innately good and innately wise. So that's where I thought we'd start, and now I'm going to turn it over to the science guy and see where he's going to go with that.
Well, thank you, Fleet. It really is an honor to be up here with you. And I'm very grateful that you have come to visit us. And also just want to say how much I respect and inspired by the work you're doing. And may it continue to flourish. And
Thank you.
We need you on this planet now. I'm a scientist by training. And let me just pick up on some of the themes that you began with. I often talk about themes in modern science that are enabling this work to go forward now, the work that we and many other colleagues around the world now are starting to do to investigate positive human qualities and how they can be cultivated and nurtured. And one of the themes relates to plasticity, both neuroplasticity as well as genetic plasticity or epigenetics. And here the idea is simply that we often are pushed and pulled by the forces around us. And our brains and our genes are being regulated wittingly or unwittingly. Most of the time, it's unwitting. Most of the time, we're subject to the forces around us, which are constantly shaping our brains. They're constantly controlling our genetic expression. So we know, for example, that the way a mother treats her offspring will actually induce epigenetic changes in the offspring, which impact that child's behavior for the entire duration of that child's life. And similarly with neuroplasticity. And so the invitation in all this work is that we can actually all take more responsibility for our own experience. And by doing that, we can more intentionally shape our brains and our gene expression in ways that can promote and sustain healthy habits of mind. And so this is a really, in one sense, a really simple idea. In another sense, I think it's a revolutionary idea, and one that is so fundamentally important in our culture today. I also talk about a theme of innate basic goodness. We scientists, at least some of us, maybe a minority, but hopefully a growing minority, use the phrase innate basic goodness. We're not afraid to use that phrase. My own reading of the scientific literature convinces me that there's actually a lot of scientific evidence for that. And while we, particularly in this election cycle, are being fed by the media a lot of negative stuff, actually, if you look objectively at the human propensity for violence and for antisocial behavior, there was a book written by the Harvard psychologist Steve Pinker not too long ago where he shows with hard-nosed data very, very beautifully, if you look over the course of the last 500 years, there has been a dramatic decline in human violence and antisocial behavior, dramatic. And that takes into account all of the wars, the terrorism, and the gun violence that is occurring. And so what we're hearing is being amplified by the media, and there's a lot of viral spread. But I often reflect on the average day of a person in our culture today, and when you reflect on the instances of positive qualities, simple acts of gratitude, of appreciation, of kindness, they far exceed the acts of antisocial behavior and of violence. And so I think that, and there also is other kinds of evidence that we know of from the scientific literature. For example, if you look in very, very young infants and you present them with puppets, for example, a scenario where puppets are warm-hearted to one another, compared to puppets being selfish, and then you hold up the puppet and see which puppet the infant prefers. Does the infant prefer the selfish one, or does the infant prefer the warm-hearted one? 95% of infants prefer the warm-hearted puppet. I mean, this is very clear. We are built to prefer warm-heartedness compared to selfishness. There's no doubt about it. And so I think that the practices that we're involved with and that we're studying and that we're promoting are ones that we think are practices that remind people of qualities they already have and help them get back in touch with these qualities to nurture them. And in this way, we think of qualities like kindness and compassion very much similar to the way scientists think about language. We know that we're all born with a biological propensity for language. But in order for that propensity to be expressed, we have to be raised in a normal linguistic community. And I think it's similar for kindness and compassion. And so we have these innate seeds, but it requires nurturing and the right kind of context in order for those seeds to flourish. And so I want to say one other thing about the topic this evening, about bringing mindfulness and other positive qualities into our culture. A number of years ago, I was at a meeting where I met someone, a very well-known, wealthy entrepreneur, and he pulled me over and he said, "Richie, do you really think that if you got all the money you needed to do the next best, most important scientific experiment with all the right controls, the kind of definitive study, that the world is going to change?" And it was kind of a wake-up call for me, and it helped me to appreciate that the scientific research is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And we need to become activists to bring this out into the world. It's kind of like climate scientists have been sufficiently persuaded by their data that they're not going to sit on their butt and just continue to collect data. And I think that we're at a point where I see this almost like a public health campaign. An urgent public health campaign, like the campaign to eliminate smoking. We must mount a campaign to reduce self-centeredness. And I think that the contemplative traditions have provided us with wonderful tools that can form the basis for helping us to do that. And I think that the scientific evidence is certainly helping, but it's not sufficient. And so I think that one of the activities that I feel we're both engaged with is really a public health campaign to promote the widespread incorporation of these practices into mainstream sectors of the culture, because that, I think, is what will produce the kind of change that we're all seeking.
Yeah, I think His Holiness has been quoted as saying that compassion is no longer a luxury for humanity. It's critical to our very survival. And I couldn't agree more in the kind of public health campaign approach. I don't know, because we're all different ages in here, but does anybody ever remember when you were a little kid or starting off in school, somebody handed you the operating manual for this whole thing? or how much training and education did you get around managing this and self-regulation and things like that, or your own physiology, or emotion regulation? Or did you get much training in how to communicate with other human beings? Probably not very much. Today, it's starting to happen, but what could be more important to lead a human life than knowing how to regulate this and how to communicate with others? And yet we haven't really been providing that kind of training. And now, of course, we've known this for thousands of years through many different traditions, but now we have the Western science to back it up, that providing human beings with some level of mind training, awareness training, and some kind of social emotional learning or emotional intelligence training, it's just a no-brainer. It's just a no-brainer from kindergarten through to the elderly. I mean, it's almost could at some point be considered criminally negligent to not provide people with that information. And the thing is that we do now have the operating manual. A combination of all the yogic sciences from the East for so many years, and Western psychology, now current neuroscience and neurobiology. We pretty much have the operating manual, more so than ever before. So I think Richie mentioned before, you mentioned the need to take that responsibility. And so, we can't pretend that the information isn't available now. It's readily available, and we can empower ourselves to begin to take more responsibility for how we engage in this world, and how we engage with others, and how we engage with our children especially. And I also feel that this is kind of one of my little pet stump beaches, I'll make it brief, but for my work around the world in prisons and doing the bearing witness work in Rwanda and at Auschwitz and many other type of work on the streets and work with the homeless in many different countries around the world, that on this planet currently I feel we're carrying an unsustainable toxic load of internalized shame and oppression in our human culture. And it's fueled by people growing up under every kind of oppression, children experiencing every kind of abuse and neglect, wars and the displacement of refugees, and people growing up under gender oppression and oppression around their gender expression or sexual orientation, the oppression of women, the violence against children around the world, that it fuels, just keeps adding to this pool, and that internalized shame and oppression will always come out as violence, endlessly. And despite the fact that the data does show that over the last 5 years there's been a precipitous decline in violence, which is really good news, at the same time there's so many of us on the planet, and because of the media and the communications, the ripple effects of violence, I think, can be pretty dire. So I think we have to begin to find ways to educate and enculturate our children into the values that we all believe in non-coercive ways, without the threat of, either buy into this mainstream set of values, however benevolent or enlightened it might be, or basically, you're going to get kicked out in some ways. And of course, we don't say that intentionally to our children, but the subtle message is there unless we're incredibly self-aware and enlightened about how we interact with our children. And then we send them into the public school system, which many have called the pipeline to our prison system. And it just gets worse. So I do think we really need a public campaign to bring in a much greater understanding of what we're up against in terms of the propensities of kind of fear-based, survival-based conditioning and where it will take us unchecked, and the amazing pathway that's available to us to cultivate awareness and compassion through these simple tools for mindfulness. And I think it does need to be, in the same way that we've been able to address some global maladies like typhoid and AIDS and malaria and things like that. I think we need a public campaign to reduce neglect and abuse and violence. And I think one of the most strategically advantageous ways, or probably efficacious ways of doing that, is to bring these basic skills of self-regulation, of mindfulness and awareness training, and a social emotional learning or emotional intelligence to more and more people. Because Rich is absolutely right. I think when we have these skills, we very naturally move in the direction of goodness. I mean, even despite everything I said, I painted a pretty dark picture about the human condition. But despite all that, what do the vast majority of people all over the planet get up every day and do? With few exceptions, they get up and do their best to take care of themselves, to take care of their families, to to partner I mean, we wouldn't be able to drive down the road if people weren't naturally partnering and collaborative and cooperative, right? We couldn't function. We wouldn't still be here as a species on a planet. And then there's the ripples of all the stuff that comes out, the very painful stuff that comes out that really is just the eruption of people's internalized neglect and abuse and so forth. The people in our prison systems, I constantly try to communicate to them in my work that I really get and have deep compassion for their situation, the injustices involved for so many, the fact that many were essentially programmed to end up there. And at the same time, the only person that can get them out is them, which is why I try to give them tools to begin to take responsibility for the decisions they're making now and find that way to empower themselves into freedom. But we also have to understand that most of them end up, it's amazing, a lot of them are still alive if you actually hear the stories of what the vast majority of prisoners went through as children, just off the chart levels of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And so I really do think it's a public health issue. I absolutely agree with you.
Well, relevant to that, perhaps I can just share findings that were published a few years ago in a very important paper in a very major scientific journal by a group at Duke University who followed a cohort of 1,000 kids from birth that were born in a town in New Zealand that's very much like Madison, a town called Dunedin, New Zealand. And they followed this cohort of 1,000 kids, and it's a very unusual study because it allows the scientists to look at relations between factors that are observed early in life and how these kids develop. And these individuals are now in their late 30s. So there are data that were published not too long ago which looked at the relation between a child's ability to regulate his behavior, engage in self-regulation, and I can say a little bit more about that in a moment, at age 4 and 5 years of age. And they looked at those metrics in relation to adult outcomes when they were 32 years of age. And at 32 years of age, some of the things they looked at were their physical health, whether they abused drugs, their financial success, very carefully controlling for the socioeconomic status of their families of origin. They also had objective measures, data from the judicial system of criminal convictions. Criminal convictions when they were adults. And what they found is that kids who had the lowest levels of self-control when they were 4 and 5 years of age were the ones who were the most likely to have poor physical health, engage in illegal drug use. They had significantly higher adult criminal convictions, and they earned, on average, in US dollars, approximately $6,000 a year less than their high self-regulation counterparts, after very carefully controlling for these other things. And the conclusion in this study was that if we can figure out a way to teach kids better methods of self-regulation and self-control when they're young, we can save taxpayers money and promote prosperity and health and well-being. And this is just a hugely important study because, and one of the other things that they observed in this study is that the measures of self-control at age 4 and 5 trump IQ, grade point average, and standardized test scores all put together in predicting those kinds of outcomes. And so these data clearly show that And as you said, Fleet, these are competences that we have that can be nurtured in our culture, in our education system, as well as in other ways. And we at least have some idea about how we might be able to do that. Finally, the scientific evidence is showing that it can be done, and these kind of data show the necessity of doing it to, if nothing else, to, it's economically crazy not to. And there is an economist at the University of Chicago by the name of James Heckman who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and one of the contributions of Heckman's work is that he has found that for every $1 that is invested in high-quality preschool intervention in the US today, by the time the individual is 30 years of age, there's a return of $7 on that investment. So if nothing else, if you're not persuaded by anything else, this makes sense on the bottom line.
Well, in contrast to that, what we've been doing, and just to see, again, I hate to keep focusing on the negative, but just to see how this conditioning plays out unchecked, right? Where we've gotten to is a multi-billion-dollar criminal justice system with a lot of you have heard the statistics that we incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners, higher incarceration rates than any country in the world by far. 2.3 million people in prison, 7 million people under some kind of correctional supervision. And to build all those prisons and the $80 billion bill for incarcerating all those prisoners, we've defunded Head Start programs, we've defunded prenatal care, we've defunded all kinds of social services that would support people and keep them out of the criminal justice system. We've even defunded our infrastructure, roads and bridges, to where our very infrastructure in this country is decaying, and to where we have really a second-class educational system compared to many other countries, way down on the list in terms of educational outcomes compared to other modern developed countries. And people have been talking, sociologists have been talking about this prison industrial complex for quite a while, that it's a self-perpetuating industry. Once any industry forms, it wants to grow. That's just natural dynamics. So they have representatives, they have lobbyists, they lobby the Congress, fear-based tactics to, we need more prisons and once you build a prison, we fill it up. And in our schools, because of this kind of propensity to fear and conflict avoidance, that, as all animal species, if we pay attention to ourselves, we spend most of our time seeking comfort and avoiding discomfort. That's what we're kind of instinctually doing, unless we claim our humanity by rising above that. But because of that, we fall prey to these kind of dynamics. And so we abdicate responsibility for much around it and turn it over to the experts, to the police, to the authorities, to the city, to the government. And so rather than being, not that we don't have parents in our schools and there aren't wonderful things going on, in total, it's nowhere near enough. And instead of the parents being in the schools, we have the police in the schools now. And we have preschool kids being cuffed and taken to the police station. Something like 3 million young children were suspended from school last year, third grade and below, and something like 3,000 preschool children were actually arrested last year. And one story of a little 4-year-old charged with assault and battery on a big, Now, it's not to say that little kids can't, be very unregulated and throw a fit that might be scary, but, assault and battery against a 6'4" police officer, and this is where it goes, and we put all the resources at the back end, warehousing human beings, essentially for profit, Because even if they're government run, which most of the prisons still are, there's a whole industry that sells the goods and services to the prison, supplies them, builds them, the guards union, it's a whole industry. So housing human beings for profit, instead of investing the money where it would have the $7 for $1 investment payoff at the beginning. And we have to reverse that whole thing. And to do that, we have to become conscious in ourselves. We have to wake up and realize all the kind of counterproductive, counterintuitive things we do around our own health management and our own behaviors, and begin to, get enlightened, so we very naturally start to tap into our own innate discipline, innate patience, innate kindness, innate generosity. We don't have to create it, it's all there. You just kind of pull away some of the conditioning and the confusion, and it all just comes out and shines beautifully. And so the same thing we need to do culturally. But if we don't do it, we get exactly the opposite, where we're defunding all the things that would create a more social capital, a more cohesive society and communities, and we're actually creating something like the biggest prison industry in the world. So again, it's just, I think, pointing to the need for us all to get out there. And I recently interviewed Dan Siegel and Rick Hansen, and both of them, and as I think Dan Siegel's a pretty tough scientist, maybe not as conservative as Richie, but they both said if mindfulness were something you could put in a pill, we'd be putting billions of dollars into it, and you'd see the commercials on TV every night, right? That the science is that it's the benefits. You can't just pop a pill; you got to do it, but it's pretty impactful, and I think we do really have to think about how can we get this out into society. We've started talking about engaged mindfulness in the last couple of years in order to, mindfulness is going into the mainstream in lots of beautiful ways, and I support it all, whether it's going into corporations or healthcare systems, K through 12 education, into the military, into law enforcement, into corrections. And also we need to get it to the people in the homeless shelters, and to the urban schools, and to the prisoners, and to people with a lot of trauma in their lives and systems. So we've kind of started this engaged mindfulness movement to bring it to the people who are marginalized and falling through the cracks of our society. And it's something that we can all find our way of doing for ourselves and our families and our communities and our schools and so forth. So we're becoming evangelists here. Pretty much we're going to have to, yeah.
So I'm curious, Fleet, I'd like to ask you a question.
Okay.
So as someone who has been both inside and outside the prison system and has worked in that system in our country, and clearly understands and is passionate about the need for bringing these kinds of strategies and practices to that sector, how do you think we can go from where we are now to it becoming more mainstream? What are your thoughts about that? Mm-hmm. And does that also, is that applicable in other sectors as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll just say something off the cuff here, kind of about the trajectory of what's happened in that work, and it may be informative. A lot of the mindfulness work with prisoners began as Dharma programs and faith-based programs. The Dharma practitioners from various Buddhist traditions and some other contemplative traditions, Siddha Yoga, Christian centering prayer, Hatha Yoga practitioners, were bringing in through prison chapel programs. And I started something called the Prison Dharma Network, which was meant to be non-sectarian across all those traditions to support that kind of work. But about, 6 or 7 years ago, I began thinking that we needed to broaden, because only so many prisoners would access chapel-based program or ostensibly religious programming, even if delivered in a very universal way. And so I was thinking, how do we get it into the mainstream of correctional programming, reentry programming, drug and alcohol treatment programming? And for that, it had to be secular, had to be mainstream, and it had to be evidence-based. And so we changed the name of Prison Dharma Network to Prison Mindfulness Institute, and we began starting research initiatives with a mainstream, secular, mindfulness-based emotional intelligence curriculum and doing research around it. And then training people to begin to deliver that curriculum. And just by putting that out there and training people, we we now have that particular program in about 16 states and 5 countries. I also began to think about the environment altogether, because no matter what we offer to the prisoners or the tools we give them for self-regulation, and there are some prisoners doing, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the first Westerners to achieve full enlightenment, if there is such a thing, might be prisoners. There are some profound, deep, long-time lifers doing deep, deep practice in prison, some amazing individuals. But for most prisoners, even though we're giving them the tools, the world they live in there, what they're up against on a daily basis, is really counterproductive to, and to them really getting traction, and then when they get out, being able to continue, and then what they're up against when they get out. So, obviously we have to start getting these same skill sets into all the different sectors of that world, so there's a cumulative effect. So about 6 years ago, we got the opportunity to start doing training with correctional officers. And we now have programs in 3 states, and I think it's going to explode, because the doorway into it, the reason we got started with it is because of a rash of suicides among correctional officers. And the corrections profession is starting to come out of the closet about the extreme healthcare risk of their workers. Correctional officers who work in secure facilities, medium and higher, for 20 years or more have a life expectancy as low as 59 years. And they're dying of every chronic stress-related illness, and they're at high risk for anxiety, depression, and suicide, substance abuse, alcoholism, domestic violence, you name it. It's just off the charts. And they're starting to recognize it and get concerned about it. So I think they're going to be reaching out more and more. And we're getting a lot of traction with the work. And Richie's doing a program, a pilot study with police here in Madison, who face similar situations. And we've seen the results of police who have very tough jobs but don't have the skills for self-regulation, and the incidences that have been happening, how damaging those are. And so then we started the Mindful Justice Initiative with other colleagues who were working with the courts, and we're bringing together leaders from the whole criminal justice spectrum, judges, lawyers, prosecutors, public defenders, defense attorneys, law enforcement, corrections executives, treatment providers, reentry specialists, victim advocates, restorative justice advocates, victims, and bringing them together for regional meetings and national meetings to begin to look at how can we create a healthy system that truly enhances public safety while actually building on social capital instead of depleting it, and which entails downsizing the system dramatically, but doing a better job. And that's starting to get traction. And we have a possibility in Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, San Jose, to create the first mindful courtroom, where everybody in the courtroom will be trained in mindfulness. The judges, the clerks, the public defenders, the defense attorneys. And can you imagine what it's going to be like? I don't know what it's going to be like, but I'm really interested. I'm curious for a prisoner to step into a mindful courtroom, I have this image that kind of popped in my head one day about mindful policing. And because I've been through it, I've been cuffed. I don't know if anybody in here has ever been cuffed. It's a very shaming exercise, and I earned it. I worked hard to get there. But I have a dear friend who was a tenured school teacher in the Denver system, a grandmother, beautiful, wonderful woman. And over some neighborhood thing about pets, they came and cuffed her, took her through the whole shaming exercise and the drunk tank and the mug shot and the whole thing. It can happen to any of us. And so anyway, my image is there's an arrest. And they get you, they cuff you, and they get you into the back seat of the car, close the door, and then the cop sits down in the front seat and he goes, "Okay, just breathe. We're going to get through this together. We're going to breathe together. You're going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. We're not going to hurt each other, and it's all going to be okay. Let's just breathe." That's my little image of mindful policing. So, we're starting to get some inroads into all the different dimensions of the system, and I think that's what it's going to take to bring about the change. The same thing's happening in K through 12 education. We're starting to get inroads there. And so I think it's that holistic, system-wide approach is my thinking. And obviously it's going to take time, and it takes effort and patience and diligence, but I don't think there's any reason why we can't get there. I think it's inevitable, in a sense. It's just, are we going to slow it down, get in the way, or are we going to get on board and see it happen in our lifetimes?
So maybe we should take some
Yeah,
questions.
open it up.
Yeah. Questions.
So great, we have a mic to pass around back there. Behind you, there's a woman behind you, yeah.
Thank you very much for your sharing your wisdom. So I'm a mindfulness teacher, and I had an opportunity to go out to the Center for Mindfulness in Massachusetts, and I'm working with Saki Santorelli and Judson Brewer and John Davidson, and we came together where Rhonda McGee, who you've worked with and other people I hope know, where we were talking about racism and how we can better engage our work as practitioners, most of us as white practitioners and people who are trying to embody mindfulness, compassion. And so the question was how to attend to the work of undoing racism very directly. And so we're on a journey there at the Center for Mindfulness, and there's been a lot of humility and welcoming of doing additional work in addition to, the mindfulness practice that I know has been really written about. So my question is, in what spaces and ways are you, as white people, working with that? Especially, I mean, we could throw in gender too, but how does that play out in your work in communities who've experienced a lot of oppression? Yeah, so those are questions. Thank you.
Well, those are really important. That's a really important. I had the opportunity to spend the day with 18 mindfulness teachers at the University of Wisconsin Health Center and people that participate in some of Richie's research. And we had this same discussion. And I think there's a lot of different elements to it. With the Engaged Mindfulness Institute, where our mission of that part of our organization is to train as many teachers as we can train, facilitators and teachers in trauma-informed approaches to sharing the practice of mindfulness in a really facilitative and empowering way with at-risk individuals, underserved communities, vulnerable populations, and so forth. And as we know, unfortunately, that includes many people of color. And so there's all the diversity issues and how, if we are middle-class white people, how do we do that work effectively? Well, first of all, it's a real goal of ours at the Institute to recruit and train as many people of color as we possibly can to become certified mindfulness teachers and facilitators to take this work to various communities. And at the same time, I think it's entirely possible for white middle-class folks, like most of us in this room are, to work with diverse communities and with people of color and people in all different situations and sectors of our society. But I think it really requires that we do our work. And I know some people here are involved in the untraining, and then there's another model. Bob, what's that one that you're working with? Groundworks. And there's other anti-racism trainings around the country, and doing some training around really the painful work of discovering what white privilege is, and really, which is almost impossible for us to see completely, no matter how much training we do. But we need to do that work, and developing cultural humility, and doing the work to develop more cultural literacy, and one thing from my Zen training that I found very helpful, Roshi Bernie Glassman, my Zen teacher, in the Zen Peacemaker work, they developed something called the Three Tenets. It was an expression of age-old human wisdom from many traditions, but they languaged it as not knowing, letting go of fixed ideas about ourselves and others as best we can, getting out of our conditioning, which is no easy feat, and then bearing witness, which is not running away, and being willing to sit in the fire and experience directly the joy and suffering of life and everything in between without the protection of our knowing. And that human beings for thousands of years in many cultures have experienced, to the extent that you can do those two things, we contact our innate wisdom and are able to respond to life in ways that are appropriate and wisdom-based and effective and not driven by our agendas or preconceptions, but an actual natural wisdom-based response to what is, right? So I think as white middle-class people working with other cultures and other groups, the practice of not knowing and bearing witness, I think, is essential. And we come back to it again and again. Like we may through that practice land on a wonderful action or intervention or something to do or say, which may be the most wonderful, wise thing in that moment, but 5 minutes later may be completely the wrong thing. So we have to completely, always coming back to not knowing and bearing witness and not knowing. So I think doing the work to educate ourselves, having the humility, doing the work to expand our cultural literacy and operating from a place of not knowing and learning to be sharing the practice much less in the old style didactic way, but as teachers, the whole profession of it's a wonderful thing, teaching, but learning to teach it more as a facilitator, a more facilitative way, where our role is to create a safe space for people, and safety is the bottom line in all this work. I mean, to me, that is job one. Human beings, from little children to the elderly, flourish when they feel safe, when they feel physically and emotionally, all of us, when we feel physically and emotionally safe. So creating safety, holding a safe space, finding some way to introduce some elements of mindfulness practice, some of these self-regulation tools, awareness tools, and then letting that and the person's own practice become their teacher, so that, and just holding that space while they reclaim their own innate qualities, right? And so that kind of empowerment model, all these things I think can contribute to our ability, because I would hate to think, and I know it can be challenging because we hear, and we'll I hear from a lot of fellow activists and people, white people shouldn't even be doing that work, and it's already some kind of exploitation and expropriation just by mere fact that you're there in that neighborhood. And I think that's a little over the top. Not to say that things haven't been done that have been clumsy and ineffective, but I think if we're willing to do the work, I think we can serve anywhere. And I've certainly found that to be true. I've found and I've made all kinds of mistakes, and I've been clumsy, and I've gotten it right back in my face at times, but I've learned, and I keep learning. And I think, another obstacle can really be, I've found, is that when we really get too caught up in our own white guilt and haven't done the work to own that and transform it. It's not that it's not reasonable to feel that. We do carry this legacy of the burden of what, white Europeans have kind of our footprint in the world, some of which has been wonderful and some of which hasn't been so great. And we do carry that legacy, and we may feel, well, I didn't do that, but until it's not there anymore, we all have to share in that and own it. But I think going into white guilt really creates a barrier between us and others. And I found myself in Rwanda, in prisons all over the country, with groups of people, and find that I sense this barrier, this tension, and I suddenly realize it's me. I'm creating it. And as soon as I relax, it goes away, and they're right there, ready to do something, ready to just have human beings interacting with each other. So
one thing I would add is simply expanding on the practice of not knowing. I think that it's important to let go of our stereotypes of how these practices are actually performed. I often say that one size is unlikely to fit all, and there are many different ways to cultivate these healthy qualities of mind, to cultivate well-being, and there may be strategies that don't look anything like what we think of as meditation in the Western world today, and that's okay. And so I think we need to be really open and think out of the box. And what may be appropriate for certain communities may just look very different than what we think of as appropriate for our communities.
I completely agree. And in our work with correctional officers, we're giving them all kinds of tools, but we've had the agenda of trying to convince them to sit for 10, 20 minutes a day and do kind of basic sitting mindfulness practice. And this last time I went out to Oregon, I just finished launching 3 new cohorts out there of officers and other correctional staff. And I just gave up on that. And instead, I actually voiced to them, I said, it'll be wonderful if you want to do that, But I realized that it's going to be difficult for a lot of you to do that. I mean, you can't really they can't do that at work, and we give them other things they can do at work without looking or feeling weird. But for many of you, you don't have time in your lives, or it's not going to make sense at home. So I opened up the space for them to start generating ways from everything they'd heard so far in the training. What are ways that you could bring this into your life? What are ways that would work for you to bring mindfulness into your life that would have nothing to do with stopping and sitting still like this for 20 minutes? And they started generating all kinds of things. So to me, that was a big breakthrough for me to let go of that. And it was hard for me to let go of that because I really believe in, the sitting thing.
Glad to be here. Glad for your wisdom. Question. My experience as a black man, to the extent that it is in the meditation community, such as it is in its various forms in our community here, I live in Madison, has been such that I feel empowered, I feel insight, I feel gratitude when we talk about issues that you're talking about. When you bring out the ideas of our innate compassion and goodness. And on a personal level, that certainly I find transforming and encouraging, and I take back to family and community. When it comes to mindfulness and the specific issue of implicit bias, I find a disconnect. I find the dialogue changes, and that the communities that I've spent time with under the broad umbrella of the meditation find a disconnect when it comes to talking about the specifics of racism and implicit bias, and applying the concepts of our innate goodness and things like that to our common welfare. So my question is, how does mindfulness, be it white guilt or whatever, that implicit bias that affects us all, there's just some of us in segments of society have power to react to that and use that or succumb to it in ways that others don't. But how does meditation and how does mindfulness help you, if I might say, deal with that ingrained, almost default, implicit bias that often my experience has been a disconnect in the dialogue or the process. Is that clear?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to that very personally, and then I'll see what Richie has to say. First of all, at least what I've been hearing as an activist for quite a few years now is that communities of color would like us white middle class folks to start training ourselves and solving our own problems to some degree and not depend on people of color to train us. But I feel like we still have to really depend on people of color. And that's why I'm so grateful for our colleague Rhonda McGee, who's a law professor at the University of San Francisco and a major voice in anti-racism work, and also an MBSR teacher. And she's written some really interesting articles on the idea of not color blindness, and we're clearly not there yet, and I don't know whether that idea will ever make sense, but she's talking about color insight. And so I really recommend looking at her work. I think she's wonderful, and she's on our faculty with the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. But speaking personally, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in St. Louis through the civil rights era and the riots of the late 60s, and around the fear and a middle-class Roman Catholic family that were basically good people and not overt racist, but they were certainly prejudiced. And I grew up around all this fear, and it was part of my radicalization as a young man, and part of what took me off into some alternative paths. But then when I landed in prison, prison was a very racially divisive environment. I was in a big federal prison, and in the big dining hall, they had two sides with a Fortunately, we did have a walk-through salad bar, which was my salvation. You could get fresh vegetables and greens off that. And you came out either side, and you came through the food lines and then back down the middle through this thing. But, so the seating area on each side, and all the African Americans sat on one side and all the whites sat on the other side, and the Latinos could sit on either side. And I was the only white person I knew that ever sat on the side with the African Americans and the Latinos. I didn't sit over there all the time, but I sat over there when I had friends over there. But it was a very racially charged environment. And a lot of my fellow prisoners who are of white European background, there were a few people like me from kind of more urban, middle class, educated background, but mostly they were from rural areas, and the level of racism was pretty extreme, and the dialogue was just heartbreaking, right? And also everything was extreme, right? Everything was extreme, and there was, in some ways, there was times when we had a lot of Cuban prisoners there. There was, anytime the balance would tip in favor of one race or another, there would, things got dicier and more belligerent. And so you were just in this world of kind of extreme racism and fear and people being really uncomfortable with their own extreme cultural manifestations and where those were hitting up against each other. And it was really hard not to absorb that. And so I'm highly aware of, from my childhood growing up in St. Louis to my time in prison, for all the internalized racism and implicit bias I have. I'm highly aware of it. I'm highly aware when I'm walking down the streets in the city and the way I react to people of color and young African American men if they're dressed a certain way. And I'm highly react when I move into this sector or that, or when I'm in a prison or I'm on a subway. I'm really aware, and it's painful. And no matter how enlightened I think I am or how much work I've done, it's there and it's painful and it's heartbreaking. And the only thing I know how to do is just stay with the pain of it. And stay with the pain of it. But I believe it's my mindfulness practice and my awareness practice that makes me aware of it in such an acute and painful way, and also gives me the strength and the resilience to stay with that pain and let it do its work on me in ways that I don't even understand how that's working. I just hope that it is working. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but...
So, and if I can just say a few words. I'm not sure I quite understood your question, but let me take a stab at it. I, as a scientist, have no illusions about the impact, particularly of short-term mindfulness training on implicit bias. I mean, there are so many things that are not going to be impacted by mindfulness training, particularly in the ways that it is being done in the standard ways that it is today. We know that there are all kinds of measures that we can assess in the laboratory that are unaffected, that we think in principle might be affected, but when we actually do the scientific research and look at this with 8 or 10 weeks of training, it's not affected by that. And so I think that implicit bias is probably something that is, in terms of really transforming it, it's not, I don't think it's a process that is going to be amenable to transformation easily. I think it's one of those really deep mechanisms of the mind that is not easily transformed. However, in agreement with Fleet, I do think that the thing we can do is bring awareness to it, so that it's not going to necessarily transform it, but I think we can become more aware of it. And the very term implicit bias connotes a bias which is subconscious or relatively opaque to awareness. And I think that one of the opportunities with the kind of awareness practices in which we're interested is that there is an opportunity to bring processes in the mind that normally escape awareness and become more aware of them. I think awareness is the first and necessary component for transformation. So if a process has any hope of being transformed, the very first and critical thing I think we need to do is to become aware of it. And so I think that holding it in awareness in the kind of way that Fleet was describing is a really important first step. And if we can help to facilitate that, I think that we're making at least a little bit of progress.
Yeah, I think that deep imprint of our conditioning is very resistant, obviously, to transformation, but if we're aware of it, we don't have to let it drive our behaviors. And I'm pretty comfortable that the conscious part of my brain and my mind at this point is not racist. But I know I have all kinds of racist conditioning and all kinds of implicit bias in my conditioning. But I think we can manage it and maybe heal and transform some of it. And I think if we're doing that, then I think we're passing, we're conscious about that, then we're not passing it on in the same way that our forebears may have passed it on unconsciously because they weren't aware of it. And I think our best hope really is in the next generations. And I think many of us know that not completely, but more so than ever, the current generations are less racist and more tolerant and more accepting across all these different things that divide us than anybody that, any citizens we've ever had in our country. It's quite amazing how they just don't buy in to so much of the stuff that was deeply imprinted in our generations. So I think that's our greatest hope, but I do believe we can all be conscious to not let whatever conditioning we have drive our behaviors.
Hi, I'm Erin Robbins. I'm a mental health counselor at UW-Madison at University Health Services, and I have the opportunity of working with college-age students in a short, kind of brief, intermittent model. So my question is, how would you both provide information for a student that you may only see 1 hour in a month? And how do you, so that's one thing. And then the other thing that I've noticed is, that people are just not, they want to get rid of their sadness. They want to get rid of their anxiety. They're not able to regulate that emotional thing. It's push, push, push. And the very principle of mindfulness, right, is to expand awareness and kind of sit with some of those emotions. So it's challenging as a practitioner to be able to kind of infuse some of those techniques. And I like what you guys are saying in terms of not sitting, because a lot of the pushback is, I don't have time for that. I have to study, and it's well, how about when you're walking in between classes, or, just kind of leading it in that way, so.
Well, I think that the invitation is really that there's nothing to be fixed. And it's really changing one's relationship to the anxiety or to the fear rather than getting rid of it, becoming friends with it in some sense. And with regard to practice, this goes back to an issue that we talked about a little bit earlier. One of the things that we've been considering in our own work is giving people the opportunity to select for themselves how they want to practice and how much they want to practice and in what context they want to practice. And one of the things that we've learned from modern behavioral science research that is specifically concerned with how new habits are established is that the best way to establish a new habit is to piggyback it onto an activity of daily living. So whatever that activity might be, it might be if you walk to class for a student and there's a specific route that they typically take, to make a commitment that during that walk from building A to B, they will each day, even if it's for 1 minute, they will be intentional about it and do a specific practice as they are walking between the buildings. And so enabling them to make the choice and then to stick with that for some period of time, whatever it is, even if it's as short as 1 minute a day. I think that we've had very unrealistic expectations for certain kinds of groups about formal meditation practice, and I think we're setting people up to fail because very few people are able to meet those expectations. And so I think we can really completely turn it on its head and give up even the expectation of any formal practice and have them just begin to seamlessly integrate it with activities of daily living. And so I think that those things are worth exploring. Now, I should quickly hasten to say that these are just conjectures at this point. None of this has been scientifically investigated. We don't know, for example, that if you invite a person to practice, say, 20 minutes a day or 40 minutes a day, we don't know if it's, quote, better to do that in one session where you practice for a full 20 or 40 minutes, or split it up into 2 sessions, or maybe do, if you're doing 20 minutes a day, maybe do 5 sessions of 4 minutes a day that are sprinkled throughout a day. We have absolutely no idea. But the likelihood from everything that we do know is that it's going to be different for different people. And so I think that being sensitive to that and using your clinical intuition about what kinds of people may be most benefited by which kind of approach would be just trusting your instincts with that, I think would be good.
I heard from someone today, and I think they were referencing your research, I'm not sure. Maybe, Bob, you and I were talking about this, I'm not sure. That combining the loving kindness practice or that kind of compassion meditation with physical activity enhance the impact? Is that?
Well, that's a conjecture.
It's a conjecture, okay. Good, we'll get this cleared up. The reason is because when somebody shared that with me, I had developed a practice when I was in prison. I walked the yard a lot regularly. It's one of the ways I stayed in shape. We had a big circular track in the main yard, and I did a lot of laps. And at one point, I realized I'm walking, and I may as well practice, so I started doing the loving kindness. And so that was a regular practice of mine for a long time, of walking and doing the loving kindness practice, and it seemed to be transformative.
Yeah, one of the intuitions for this actually came from a conversation that I had with His Holiness the Dalai Lama once, who was telling me about his daily physical exercise routine. And he does physical exercise pretty much every day, aerobic exercise. And when he practices, he's doing very specific, and when he exercises, he's doing very specific meditation practices along with his physical exercise. And it dawned on me that we know from modern neuroscientific research that the best non-pharmacological strategy to promote neuroplasticity is aerobic exercise. Now, there are a lot of things that haven't been studied, but among the things that have been studied, aerobic exercise does induce neuroplasticity, increase plasticity. But increasing plasticity in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad. If you increase plasticity and you are in a toxic environment and your mind is filled with unwholesome thoughts, that is a prescription for disaster. And you can think about the average American gym where people are working out and watching gunk on television. One of the insights from this conversation is the idea of combining aerobic exercise with contemplative practice in a way that would be a win-win. And so, for people often ask me, well, isn't running meditation? That's my meditation. Or going out on a bike ride. And one of the things that I often say is, well, maybe there are some elements that are similar, but when we put our butts on a cushion, one of the things that we do is we invoke the intention that we're doing this not primarily for ourselves, but really for the benefit of others. Now, it's possible to do physical exercise in that same way, and you can invoke the intention that I'm going to tone my body in order to promote increased energy so that I can be more effective and help others, and really adopt that as a very deep intention before, during, and after you engage in your physical exercise. And we don't know if that will change the actual biology of the physical exercise, but it's certainly an empirically tractable question. And all of the evidence that we do have leads me, both as a scientist and a practitioner, to believe that it might. And so I think that that's another thing that we can do with people who are already doing certain kinds of physical activity on a regular basis.
Well, I have a related question for you based on something you said, and I hope that research gets done, by the way. The intentionality behind our practice, right? So I've heard some conversations and some criticism, generally coming from more traditional Dharma communities about the mindfulness movement and so forth, and around this, and somehow talking about, well, a lot of the mindfulness movement is simply about psychological well-being. Sounds like a pretty good thing to me that we could all use more of, and I doubt if there's that many Dharma practitioners that would stick with it if they weren't experiencing some improved psychological well-being. But nonetheless, we do have in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions and in other religious traditions this motivation of practice not only to liberate ourselves but to benefit others. And so my question is, and again, I certainly don't think we'd want to say, well, we're not going to give mindfulness to those who haven't accomplished the Mahayana attitude. That would be ridiculous. But do we have research that indicates the impact of that intentionality in terms of the outcomes of practice?
Yeah. We don't really have research which has disentangled the intentionality from the practice itself. And again, I think that this is work that a number of us in our center, Cortland Dahl is here, and we've been talking about studies to begin to disentangle this, where you can actually examine the differential impact of the intention and from the actual practices.
It's having the altruistic intention.
Exactly. And you know, there is the very first randomized controlled trial that was ever done of mindfulness-based stress reduction was actually done here in Madison, and it was a study that we did with Jon Kabat-Zinn. It was published in 2003, and this was the study that we did at the Promega Corporation, and because it was the very first randomized controlled trial that was ever done of MBSR, John felt sufficiently strongly about this that he actually flew out to Madison every single week and he taught the class himself. And so one of the interesting things that we observed in that study, and the reason why I told you that John was the teacher is an important element to this. So those of you who know John know that he is a very extraordinarily effective and charismatic teacher, and someone who I think really embodies and is able to very effectively convey the view, so to speak. And one of the things that we looked at really super carefully in this study is the relation between practice time, how many minutes per day people practiced, and every one of the outcome measures that we assessed, including measures of brain function, measures of immune function, psychological measures, a whole bunch of different things. And we did not find a single association between practice time and any of the outcome measures. None. It was just a complete and total bust. So one of the interpretations of that is that, and there were people, and the way we did this is that we had the participants fill out daily logs of their practice, and they gave them to us, and John did not see them until after the whole class was finished. So we protected the anonymity of the participants very, very carefully, so they were reporting to us and not to John. And we had a big honesty manipulation where we basically told the participants how important it was to really be honest in their reporting of practice time. And some of the people reported that they practiced zero, that they did not do a minute of practice outside of class time. And their changes were just as robust as people who are practicing 45 minutes a day. Absolutely no difference. And so one interpretation of that is that these people got the view. And their changes were due to getting the view that was conveyed by John. And the practice was completely irrelevant to any of the changes.
Unfortunately, that's a support for some of the neo-Advaita kind of cognitive approaches to waking people up without practice, but maybe we need to study that too.
I spend a lot of time, and maybe I've wasted a lot of time on my meditation. I'm a great believer in practice, but I also think that at the early stage, maybe this is something that can occur at the early stages, but this is something that we need to study, and I think there are probably big individual differences here, and it's certainly, I'm not at all suggesting that we not practice, but it's complicated.
Yeah, if I had to do conjecture, I would think that it would have something to do with early stage impact for people who haven't been introduced to the view.
Exactly.
Just being introduced to the view alone
With someone like John.
It's going to, someone like John, exactly, is going to have quite an impact. Yeah. Maybe we'll take a couple more if we have any more questions out there. Yes, in the middle there.
I have more of a comment and maybe to get your reaction to that. So I, at the risk of maybe upsetting a few folks, I can't help but think that the movement around mindfulness is somewhat elitist. And I say that because many of the people that teach mindfulness have many credentials behind their names. And I'm wondering how we can affect a public health initiative and, this whole movement without those credentials, without that that need to have more education around it or a certain name that's associated with the movement.
Yeah, that's an area of particular concern for me. I'll say something about it and then see what Richie has to say. I agree. I think the mindfulness movement is fairly elitist in its current condition. The Western Dharma communities have been very concerned about the lack of diversity now for quite a while. Many communities are working very hard to find ways to become more diverse and to open up. I know some of the insight meditation communities have been at the forefront of this, Spirit Rock and others, the East Bay Dharma Center in Oakland and others, and the head of the Shambhala community, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, has been really pushing us in this direction for quite a number of years now. We have major diversity initiatives and anti-racism training and different things going on in the community. But, Western Dharma is still very white and very middle class. And then if you go to mindfulness conferences, it's even worse. I go to a lot of them. Go to the Center for Mindfulness conferences. I go to the Mindful Leadership conferences, the Mind of Life conference in DC, and it's whiter and more educated and less diverse and more elite in a sense than even the Western Dharma movements. So I think we have a long way to go, which is why we started the Engaged Mindfulness Institute and why we've recruited as many faculty as we can who are from diverse backgrounds, and why we're very proactively trying to find ways to reach out and network and to recruit a more and more diverse student body with each cohort. So I think that's very important. I think the credentialing issue is a very interesting one. There's a lot of vagaries that come with credentialing, and there's good and bad with it, right? So one of the things that's been interesting about the mindfulness movement is now there's a lot of jobs available. You know, you can get paid to bring mindfulness into a hospital or a corporation. In some cases, be paid relatively well, and you could have a 40-year Dharma practitioner who's you know, an empowered teacher, lineage holder in the Zen tradition or Theravada, and they couldn't get that job if their life depended on it. But a PhD or physician who's, you know, done a couple of weekends and can claim that they can teach mindfulness can get the job, right? So I mean, that's can be a little unsettling, but it's just part of how things evolve. I mean, we have to work all this stuff out. It's one of the reasons for the Engaged Mindfulness Institute that we're not requiring college degrees. Now, we are intentionally trying to reach out to professionals and paraprofessionals who are already working in the criminal justice and social services fields, and education and healthcare and mental health. That's kind of our target audience, but specifically, especially people of color who are working in those fields. So many of them will be professionals with degrees, but we're not restricting it to that. Also, there's a Mindfulness Teacher Association being formed as we speak, and it's going to be accrediting training organizations like ours and others like the Center for Mindfulness, which doesn't really need accreditation being university-based, but you know, it'll probably be, it will be part of. John Davidson's involved in this effort. And like the UCLA MARC program and the Mindful Schools program and the Mindfulness Institute and some others. So they will accredit these training programs, and then people who graduate from these programs will be able to, kind of like if there's a yoga alliance now, so you might get your yoga certification through a Iyengar or, you know, one of the other many different types of hatha yoga. But if they are part of the Yoga Alliance, then once you get you can apply to the Yoga Alliance, and then your certification is recognized, right? And you get the letters after your name and so forth. And so I've been a strong voice within the emergence of this Mindfulness Teachers Association that they will not require college degrees. They just will require that you complete a certification in an accredited program. Now, some of these certification programs, like Center for Mindfulness and like the UCLA program, do require graduate degrees, and you know, they have their strategy and their reasons for it. But I think we are working to try to find ways. We don't want to lower the bar on the training. Like our Engaged Mindfulness Institute, we have a one-year training that leads to a potential 300-hour mindfulness facilitator training, and then a second year that leads to a potential 500-hour mindfulness teacher certification, which I think is kind of how it's going to line up with this new Mindfulness Teacher Association. We'll see. And it's a very daunting program. It is very intense. And even once you complete it, the certification process is very intense. But we are really working hard to make it work for some ex-cons who are doing it and other folks who are doing it who are not used to an academic setting, and we're really trying to support them. But we're not dumbing it down. We're not lowering the bar. We want people to come out really well trained and get a credential that really means something. But we're trying to make that available to people who don't have the money to go get a master's degree or get a PhD or the time or the ability to focus in that way, but they still have tremendous potential to be credentialed, to bring mindfulness into communities with some kind of credential in a professional way so that they can be recognized and do it and get paid for it and so forth. So anyway, that's one response and that we're working toward. But I hear you, it's a real issue.
Yeah, I really have little to add other than to say that I completely agree. It's a serious, complicated issue. I'm really happy that there are people like Fleet and others who are engaged in thinking through these issues. Personally, I think requiring a specific kind of college degree or something of that sort is ridiculous. But I also think that it's hard to assess the kind of qualities which are meaningful that we would want in place for someone to go out and teach. The other thing that I should just say on a very different but related vein is that if we're really going to scale this and bring this at scale into the world, the model that we're using now will not work. It just is unsustainable. We cannot possibly have enough teachers, however they're trained, and however we decide to credential them or not. It's not possible. And so I think that we need to think in a completely different way about how to bring this to the world. And it's going to need to involve technology, for better or for worse. And I think that we can harness technology in creative and useful ways to bring this to literally tens of millions of people at scale. We can't do that with the current models. So that's one thing that I think will be a serious issue going forward. When I talk to people who are interested in solving global problems, who are at the forefront of solving global problems, the first thing they ask is scalability. And the current models just don't cut it, and they're not interested. And they say, come back when you can figure out a way to scale it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're using combinations of live training and technology to train teachers, and I don't think we could do that purely with technology. But certainly for people to be introduced to the practice, I think that can completely be done on a wide scale level through technology, and has to be. And eventually, you know, some people have really resisted this idea because, you know, people are protective about the integrity of how this stuff gets passed on, and they want it to be of value and not be superficial. But I think as we can get it out more in the culture, we can start moving to a kind of each one teach one model that may become part of parenting, that'll become, you know, it'll become more part of our culture. It'll become part of the way parents parent. And we'll still have, you know, I think they're very credentialed and the lineages for people to do deep work and retreats and deep training. But in terms of embracing the basics of self-regulation and awareness, I think we'll be able to transmit that in a much more scalable way. And we have to be open to that, absolutely. Well, okay, this will be the last one then.
Well, thanks so much for your wonderful kindness and teaching.
Can you hold that up?
Oh, sorry. Thanks so much for your wonderful kindness and teaching. This is kind of an add-on to your comments about the effects with the pro-mega people who had just learned, you know, mindfulness. I know that you've also done research with people who have had like tens of thousands of hours of meditation training, and you have your own personal experience on how much your practice has changed. I just got this feeling when you said that it's like, wait, you know, I mean, you're almost saying that, you know, practicing more isn't a benefit in it, and yet at the same time, I know from personal experience and also from your findings, there must be evidence that says that practicing more is beneficial.
Absolutely, and yeah, and so please don't walk away with the idea.
Richie said you don't need to. No, he didn't
practice
say
is
that.
important. So one of the there was an article published in the New Yorker a number of years ago, which I loved. It was an article featuring the lives of three people. One was Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. A second was Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, and a third was this guy named Ed Wilson, who is a very famous neurosurgeon at UCSF, and they're all the best in the world at what they do. And the article was really asking what's in common among these three people. Practice, practice, practice. So despite what I said,
Actually, hasn't there been some research across many disciplines that there's something around this number of 10,000 hours of practice that's connected to what we think of as mastery level in many disciplines?
yes. So there is that, and we clearly see in the long-term practitioners, in a number of studies, relations between the number of lifetime hours of practice and certain measures that we can assess in the laboratory. So I think that the finding that I was referring to earlier may be specific to at the very beginning when people have not been exposed to these practices before. It's over a very short period of time, just 8 weeks. And so that really is very different than doing practice over years.
Well, before we end, I want to complete our very scientific research study here. So if sometime during this talk and dialogue you remembered to flash or return to embodied presence, please raise your hand. Oh, wow, you did really good. Yeah. Great. And some of us didn't, and it's not so easy, is it? You know, I once remember hearing Sogyal Rinpoche give, he's a wonderful teacher in the Tibetan tradition, and he talked about that, you know, despite whatever we've trained in or been introduced to, it's remembering to remember to remember to remember what we know to do, right? And it's not so easy, as we all know. That's kind of what we're up against. Again, thank you so much, and Richie, it's been a joy to do this with you, and you know, I know you're a hometown hero here, but you know, out in the world, you're a major hero to all of us in this movement, and what you've done, what the science and your colleagues have done, are opening up doors all over the world to bring these beneficial tools to humanity. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a privilege to be here with you, Fleet, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.